Dywad, gyfeillion, niwad, diofyn am genad, diofyn am genad, diofyn am genad,
Hello everyone, welcome back. I'm Greg Brownderville. I've got a very special episode for y'all today. I want to give you a little bit of an introduction because this is going to be an unusual episode. I've got a double header for you. I'm going to interview the eminent British historian Ronald Hutton, and then later in the episode, I'm going to talk with the beloved British storyteller, poet, and songwriter called Hugh Lupton. A common thread in these conversations is a focus on horse imagery in British folklore, with a particular emphasis on a Welsh folkloric figure known as Mari Lwyd, or in English, the Mari Lwyd. Some of you know about the Mari Lwyd, others of you may not. If you don't know about her, don't worry, I'm going to get Ronald Hutton to explain. Also, Hugh wrote a wonderful song called the Mari Lwyd that draws on the Welsh lore, and he wrote the words to it. His collaborator, Chris Wood, set it to music and performed it. It's just an eerily beautiful, beautifully eerie song. I'll play you that song before Hugh and I discuss it so you'll know what we're talking about. Also, I will share some footage that I captured myself just with my iPhone over Christmas in Wales of the Mari Lwyd. Some of you know I went to Wales over Christmas, and that one of the main motivations behind that trip is that I wanted to see the Mari Lwyd in person, and I did in several towns, several different manifestations of this wonderful folkloric figure. The conversations in this episode are wide-ranging, so we will talk about things other than the Mari Lwyd. For example, Ronald talks about other instances of horse imagery in British folk life, and Hugh and I talk about a whole variety of things, including British mumming plays, with which he has quite a bit of experience. The conversation with Ronald Hutton is just audio, but the conversation with Hugh is a video conversation that was conducted remotely this week. He's in Britain, and I was here in Dallas, Texas. All right, y'all, enjoy.
Thank you, friends. Talk about the oh, look at that. Oh, she didn't get it. Oh, she loves that. She loves it. Thank you. Come on then, Pat.
The Mari Lwyd is a South Welsh custom held around midwinter, and consisting of taking a horse's skull decorated with ribbons and a white sheet put on a pole, and it's taken from house to house with songs, and the singers are admitted to the house, and if the people inside are clued into the custom, they sing answers to the people outside. It's an extremely colourful custom, both audibly and visually. It takes its place in a much wider setting of midwinter customs of taking animal effigies door to door, found in different places in southern Britain. Mari Lwyd is the Welsh version. The East Kent version is the Hwden horse. There's the old tulip or ram in the southern Pennines, and the old horse a bit further north from that and in Cheshire. And the ox, a kind of paper ox's head, or canvas one called the Broad, which was taken around the southern Cotswolds. That's near where we are now, up around towns like Tetbury in Gloucestershire. All these are found in the 19th century. What this is really about is poverty. When you look at the people in each community who take round the animal effigies, they're the same kind of people who perform mummers' plays, sword dances, and Plough Monday plays, and who go around Christmas carolling. They are the people from the poorest parts of the community who need to earn extra at this time of year when work is pretty scarce in order to have Christmas cheer. And the classic age-old symbiosis by which they could do it is entertaining those who had some food or drink, later money, to spare. So they'd go to the pubs, they'd go to the big houses, they'd go out on the streets, and they'd also go door to door, making their performance, whatever it was, and being rewarded. And in that way they kept their dignity. They had a service to perform, which people valued. And at the same time, they managed to get the wherewithal to have a proper Christmas. It only, as far as I know, happens at Newport. So it's a classic intersection of two very different traditions. Newport's a very radical town. It was an industrial community. It's still one of the most culturally vibrant and economically deprived areas of Wales. And it venerates its radical past, which is very considerable. The Mayor of Newport was one of the great radical figures of 19th century Britain and was tried and sentenced for his activity and is justly honoured there. So it's a bit hard to have any kind of cultural focus in Newport without some revolutionary politics creeping in. It's actually quite hard to say why Welsh has survived so well and Scottish and Irish Gaelic hasn't. One reason is that the people who promoted Welsh hooked onto the new medium of television very early. And there was a wonderful Welsh children's cartoon character, a lovable duck. And in order to follow the story, the children had to learn Welsh. But there's been a considerable goodwill on the part of both native Welsh and Welsh settlers in general to promote the language as part of local identity. This works for certain areas of Scotland too quite well. Irish is not doing so well in Ireland, possibly, and I'm speaking as an outsider and possibly ignoramus here, because it's taught in schools. And so there's a kind of official and institutional status to it that robs it of this kind of countercultural and personal and private value that the Celtic languages have in Britain. Well, there are two different things going on with the Abbots Bromley horn dance. One is the dance itself, which starts off, according to the records, which are reasonably good, as a perfectly normal Midlands, England, hobby horse dance. Hobby horse dancing is a craze of the later Middle Ages, Tudor period, often requiring a specialist or even a professional to dress up as a tournament knight and dance with this framework of light wood covered in the trappings of a war horse, and conduct a dance which is technically very accomplished and is a great entertainment. It's genuinely impressive. This really loses popularity in the 17th, early 18th century, and I think that the ritual animal disguises, like the wooden horse and the Mari Lwyd, are later versions of the hobby horse, that it splits off into them in different regions when the general custom decays. In the case of Abbots Bromley, the hobby horse dance survived because it had really old reindeer antlers added to it, possibly in the early 17th century. They're not there in the records from the 16th century. They definitely are there by the later 17th. The antlers have been dated, and they go back to the 10th century, so the early medieval. But they come from antlers that have been domesticated, have been castrated. It makes a difference, the antlers. And there are no domesticated reindeer, or indeed wild reindeer, anywhere in Britain at any time in history. So they're imported. There was a local tradition that a local Lord Paget, brought them back from the Caucasus, which is entirely possible. But those glamorous antlers made the hobby horse dance at Abbots Bromley, this little village in the West Midlands, survive, whereas the other dances died out. And the other dimension of the dance is that it echoes something really archaic, that when early medieval churchmen complained about seasonal celebrations, they didn't spend much time on Halloween, Midsummer, May Day. They focused on midwinter, and two figures they loathed in the winter ceremonies, which were the old woman and the horned man, meaning a man or a bunch of men wearing antlers or horns and the skins of beasts. These complaints die out round about the year 1100, and we hear no more of the custom after that. But the Abbots Bromley horn dance, although it's not continuously ancient, really strikes a very primeval note by recreating the dance of the horned men in prehistory. Hugh Lupton is probably the greatest English storyteller of the present day, and he takes his material from many different sources and always delivers it superbly.
The Hutton horse, the Mari Lwyd, all bone-faced, the deathless am I, heavy with full 2,000 years, bridled with sorrow, saddled with tears. I canter through pastures of tremble and quake, I gallop the track between sleep and awake, seeking the deep of welcome and stint for my tears. The medded queen, the Mari Lwyd, I was mother of all of the herds. 10,000 years my shining foals, bridled with starlight, saddled with gold. I leapt the divide between living and dead, I quickened each year with a toss of my head, seeking the deep of beauty, and never grew old. But Mother of God, the Mary mild, the pregnant Virgin came, bursting with Jehovah's seed, entered my stable, cried out her need. With rope I was dragged from the birthing straw, aching with foal I was heaved to the door, swapping warmth for bitter weather. and the birth of a rival creed. So now I'm nightmare, I'm rattling womb, the Orpington wraith I've become. Forced into dark, you've made me a fiend, bridled with shadow, saddled with scream, from window to window, traversing the night, my face in your glass in a shudder of light, seeking the deep of welcome befitting a queen. Let me in once again, let me in.
All right, Hugh Lupton, thank you so much for spending some time with me today. I'm excited to talk with you.
It's a great pleasure.
You know, I was in England over Christmas and I met up with the historian Ronald Hutton. And
Yeah.
I mentioned you, and he said, "Oh, he's the best storyteller we have in Britain. He's always superb." I don't know if you know
That's very
him.
kind of him.
Have you met him?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I know Ronald. Yeah. He's very generous.
Yeah, I love his work, and I really enjoyed meeting him, getting to talk with him.
Yeah, he's extraordinary. He's encyclopedic.
Well, one thing that I wanted to talk with you about is just how you got into this whole storytelling game. How did you get interested in it? How did it happen?
Yeah, well, I've always loved traditional stories. My great uncle was a writer called Arthur Ransom, who is well known. I don't know if he's so well known in the United States, but in England he wrote a series of books called Swallows and Amazons and Swallowdale, and they're kind of classic children's books written in the 1930s. But in his early life, he went to Russia and collected folk tales, and a collection was published in the late 19-teens called Old Peter's Russian Tales. And because he was a relative, we were all raised on these Russian fairy tales. And I suppose I first heard them when I was 7 or 8. And it was my first encounter with real, proper fairy tale. I'd probably been given some kind of anodyne versions of, you know, Cinderella and the Three Little Pigs, but suddenly it was the world of Baba Yaga and Prince Ivan and the Witch Baby, Sadko the Merchant, the Fool of the World and the Flying Ship. Is wonderful, magical, terrifying. I found them very frightening, but at the same time, very, I guess, something in me responded to their vitality. So that was, I guess that was my first encounter. And then I grew up in the late 60s. You know, I was in my late teens in the late 60s and early 70s. And there was a huge folk revival in Britain at that time, and in the States, I think. So in my teens, you know, I was encountering some of the great ballads, the Tamlin and the Little Musgrave, Lady Barnard, Thomas the Rhymer, all those extraordinary kind of magical ballads. And also, I was a big fan of Robin Williamson and the Incredible String Band, and that whole, I suppose it was folk music meets the kind of counterculture thing at that time. And I started singing and learning ballads and steeped myself in that tradition. And I guess that was really my first experience of performing traditional narrative was via the ballads. And then I got involved in different things, different kinds of street theatre and things like that. And then started encountering people who were telling stories, and came to the realization that I'm not really a musician, but storytelling was a way of engaging with that material, and formed a group with some friends called the Company of Storytellers, and we toured all over the UK for a long time. And that was really, and there wasn't really a tradition. We were kind of inventing a tradition, and I suppose apprenticed to each other in this process of finding a way of making the stories speak to this time. So yeah, that was really the kind of the big fermentation, was when we formed the Company of Storytellers.
I so admire people who have the get up and go and the vision to forge careers for themselves, lives for themselves, without relying on patrons of one kind or another. And the university is a patron for many artists, writers, storytellers. Did
sure.
I admire folks who are able to do it without that patronage. Did you think about attaching yourself to the university or trying to go the academic route, or was that never appealing to you?
Yeah, I started a degree in English and dropped out. And then a bit later, I trained as a teacher. And working with kids is a great apprenticeship in telling stories.
But the life of the academician, what was nothing that you were particularly drawn to? I mean, the whole thing of becoming
not really. Oh, I've always read quite widely, but I've never been drawn into that world.
What do you think it was about you that pulled you more towards this independent route of kind of DIY, doing it yourself, figuring out?
Well, we were sort of working in kind of unknown territory, I guess. There wasn't a route, an obvious route to follow in terms of, how to perform traditional material. But at the same time, I guess, well, when I was in my late teens, I made friends with a guy called Ross Daly, who's a musician. And he ended up moving to Crete and studying the lira, which is sort of upright fiddle. And he was a brilliant musician, but he was determined not to follow the kind of obvious routes. And he kind of went and apprenticed himself to various old guys who were, selling tobacco in those little booths you get in Greek towns, who were kind of considered masters of the lira. And I was very, very attracted to that route, I guess, to kind of bypassing the academic and just steeping myself in the material. Yeah.
Did you find yourself being drawn to British folklore as a child? Were you hearing people tell stories and storing them in your imagination?
Yeah, I didn't really hear people tell traditional stories. I heard a lot of wonderful talkers. There was an old woman who used to babysit for me and my brother and sister. Her name was Jenny Wing. And she'd grown up in a big farm in South Cambridgeshire. And she was of the generation that had been sent into service when she was 12 years old to work as a maid in a big house in London. And I think she must have kind of dwelt on home, just turned home over and over and over in her mind when she was away from home. And so as an old woman, she had this almost day-to-day memory of her childhood in this world that probably hadn't changed very much for 200 years when she was a little girl in the 1880s and 1890s. And so when she talked, it was as though a film was almost rolling behind your eyeballs as you listened to her. Very visual, vivid talk. And that made a big impression on me. But I didn't really hear stories being told until I became a storyteller in my early 20s, I guess, and started seeking it out.
I love hearing you tell stories. I'm a big fan of your work. And here a while back, I came across that poem that you wrote about the Mari Lwyd. I guess, did you think of it as a poem, or did you conceive of it as a song when you were writing it?
It was written as a song.
It was written as a song.
Yeah.
Did you have
Yeah.
the tune in mind?
I didn't have the tune. No, Chris Wood gave it a tune, but I've done a lot of work with Chris, and we have a kind of, I don't know, a kind of a sympathy. He seems to be able to find melody for things that I write.
That is such a beautiful
Yeah.
song.
Yeah, I mean, it's based on this extraordinary idea, and I don't know what its provenance is, but I just loved it. The idea that when Mary comes to the stable to be delivered of the Christ child, a mare that's about to drop a foal has to be dragged out of the stable to make room for her.
It really turns the story on its head. It really turns the story. It really turns that biblical story on its head, because
it really does. Yeah.
The stable is thought of as a place of no prestige, a lowly place for the Christ child to be born in. And yet in that story, it's what the Mari Lwyd wants and can't have. She's driven out. She can't have that space.
Yeah, that's right. And so ever since, she's been looking for somewhere to come in out of the cold and drop the foal. And if there was ever a story about, one religion displacing another, that must be it. The horse is sacred to the Celts. And I think sacred probably across Northern Europe. So in a way, that poem is a sort of little retelling of that legend.
And Hugh, where did you hear this version of it? How did you come across this version of the provenance of the Mari Lwyd myth?
Yeah, well, I mean, I came across it in a book by Caitlin Matthews, and she's vague about her provenance. I must ask her sometime, actually, where she found it. But she says there is a legend that. Beyond that, I don't know what its origin is, but I was just struck by it. It just seemed to carry a truth. So despite the lack of provenance, it seemed a story worth playing with and exploring.
So powerful and poignant. What book is that by Caitlin Matthews?
Yeah, it's called, it's a book about the Mabinogion, and it's called Mabon and the Mysteries of Britain.
I see.
Yeah, it's my favorite of her books, actually. Yeah,
have you witnessed the Mari Lwyd ritual?
Mari Lwyd, I haven't. You're one up on me. I've seen film, but I've never been there.
I
How did you
went,
find it?
I
I
absolutely
know.
loved it. And I saw a
Yeah.
few different ones. And one thing that struck me is that they're strikingly different from town to town.
Yeah.
In Gunwood, it was this fun-loving kind of experience. I mean, kind of presentation and performance. Very much, I don't know if you'd say it was for the kids, but it was family friendly and it was very good-natured, jolly. In Casnewydd, Newport, it was very political. I would even say maybe revolutionary
Right.
overtones. So it was interesting to see how the personalities of different towns were expressed through the Mari Lwyd.
Yeah. In a way, hard to make it a playful thing with that horse's skull. I mean, it has a very, very kind of powerful, deep, mysterious presence.
It gets at something that I've really been thinking about a lot lately. And I talked to Ronald about this. The ritual calendar, for me, teaches that Punky Night or Halloween, All Hallows, is lurking behind Christmas and
Absolutely
giving it a little bit of eeriness and spookiness. And I've always felt that Christmas is most enchanting when you can still feel that little bit of Halloween back there hiding behind all the merriment. And the Mari Lwyd brings this out, and I think your song does as well, that especially that last stanza where you talk about how she's been made to be a kind of fiend, a scary presence.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah,
that
that's
came
right.
I think that came through more in Newport, Casnewydd, than in some of the other towns I saw the Mari Lwyd in.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in the song, I wanted to, well, in the second verse, I'm kind of imagining the Paleolithic cave paintings at Chevaux or somewhere like that, you know, of the galloping herds, this kind of mother of all the herds, I think I call her. And then the sort of the diminishment. And it was part of a series of stories that I was telling about horses and horse magic. It was originally devised for that. And yeah, you're right. In the last verse, she's become the Uffington Wraith, you know, have you come across the Uffington horse, that Celtic horse cut into the chalk on the side of a hill, which is a skeletal figure? Yeah.
And it made me think about a part of the Mari Lwyd custom, this business of going from house to house, seeking entry, and having this battle of wits called the punco in Welsh.
Yeah, extraordinary. Yeah.
Yeah, and I noticed the part about the shining foals. The first time I listened to it, the feeling of loss that comes through in your song moved me to tears. I didn't even know that this story of being displaced, the pagan heritage being displaced by a rival creed, would arouse that kind of emotion in me. But your song awakened me to that.
Funnily enough, I told the story to a friend. In fact, I sang the song to a friend, and she mentioned it to her vicar of her local church. And the next Christmas, alongside the ox and the ass by the manger, that he'd reinstated. There was a horse there as well. He'd welcomed the Mari back into the stable. Yeah.
How about that? It reminds me of something that happened to me some years ago. I'm from the Delta region where the blues comes from.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And there's a town in my home county called Cotton Plant, which has produced some famous singers, especially in the blues and gospel traditions.
Mm-hmm.
And one of these is a fella named Peetie Wheatstraw, the devil's son-in-law. And he left Cotton Plant and became a very famous man in East St. Louis, was one of the 5 best-selling bluesmen of his day, blues singers of his day. But this whole business of associating himself with the devil, which may or may not have been merely a marketing ploy, I don't really know how deeply that
Same was said
ran.
of Robert Johnson, I think, wasn't it?
Right, and Wheatstraw predated Robert Johnson, and a lot of people think that Johnson drew a lot from Peetie Wheatstraw. But his family back in Cotton Plant, who were quite religious, I've actually known some of them, did not take kindly to his associating himself with the devil. And he died violently, as people in the Delta tend to do when they've associated themselves with the devil. I've myself have collected a number of folk tales that end this way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
People who sell their, as they say, sell themselves to the devil, wind up dying these violent deaths. And this happened with Wheatstraw. He was in a car that was hit by a train. They shipped his body home to Cotton Plant, and his own father said, well, if he's the devil's son-in-law, he doesn't have any business in the church, does he? Just take him out back and throw him in the ground. And this was long before my time, but I found out about it, and I knew a guy named Jab who was a gospel singer and attended this very church that Peetie Wheatstraw was not allowed to have a funeral in. And so I found this Peetie Wheatstraw song whose melody is exactly the melody of an old gospel sorrow song called You Got to Move that I grew up singing in church, and that Jab and his group sang. He was in a singing group. And I said, Jab, we could finally let Peetie Wheatstraw in that church if you and I got together one day and sang this song as a composite. I'll do a Peetie Wheatstraw verse and you do because Peetie Wheatstraw had a song called Ice and Snow Blues. It was, as I say, exactly the same melody. So I sang a Peetie Wheatstraw verse and he sang a verse of You Gotta Move, which is a gospel song, and we went back and forth. So in a way, it was kind of like that story you were telling about the Mari Lwyd, because Peetie Wheatstraw finally got in that church in a way through his music.
Yeah. Lovely. That's a good story.
I noticed that you're interested in and have written about the mumming plays.
Yeah.
How did you get interested in mummery?
Well, again with Chris Wood, we got interested. We came across some recordings of an old guy who had been in the mummers plays in Kent prior to the First World War. And he starts off by this wonderful recording, and he starts off by saying, Grandfather Christmas, he's dead and gone. He died down in Orpington Hospital. The Turkish Knight, he's gone now. And he kind of goes through all the characters, but seeing them in terms of his friends who played them rather than the characters themselves. And I love that sort of juxtaposition between, the mortality of the people who carry a tradition and the immortality of the tradition itself. And the way that, St. George and the Turkish Knights, and they're all immortals. They're endlessly reappearing, but for a little while, us humans, us mortals carry them and then pass them on. And so we put together this piece that was really, it was about using the mummers play, but it was really about tradition and the way tradition works. I've always loved the mummers play. I was in mummers plays when I was in my 20s in a street theatre group. We used to regularly do them.
I got to
that
see,
extraordinary.
I got to watch one for the first time when I was in Britain over the holidays.
Yeah, yeah,
Wonderful.
yeah. I mean, you know, I'm sure Ronald would disagree with me because there's no evidence, but it seems to me that they're playing out some archaic death and resurrection ritual. I mean, even though the mummers play, I think the records go back to maybe the 18th century of this play being performed, but my intuitive feeling is that, you know, there's archaic material at the back of the mummers play.
I've always intuited the same thing, and I know what you mean. There's no evidence of it, but it resonates very deeply with me, and I have that same intuition. And I wondered what you might think about the role of the quick quack doctor, the quack doctor.
Yeah.
I mean, what it for you is the deep meaning of that character? What does that character embody for you?
Well, I mean, at the risk of being sort of seen as a kind of romantic, you know, for me, it kind of echoes back to kind of shamanism. And, you know, the function of the shaman to go into another world and retrieve the soul of a sick person and bring it back. And, you know, it's all humor and it's very lighthearted. But at the core of it, you know, that moment with the elegumpine solution, when when St. George is kind of resurrected, it carries it's a very powerful thing, and I always find it very moving.
I do too.
And again, it just echoes back to something primal.
For our listeners who may not be familiar with the basic plot, how would you sum up the core plot of the Mumming play? I know there are these local variations, but what is
lots
it?
And lots of variations. Yeah, but there's always a fight, usually between St. George and a Turkish knight or some other character, and it's endlessly readjusting itself. Sometimes there's a character who steps in between them. Sometimes it's St. George himself, but someone gets killed, and a doctor is called on. Is there a doctor in the house who can cure this deep and deadly wound? And the doctor has many different names, but the doctor comes in and he's got a little bottle of alicumpine solution, or again, it has many names. And the doctor tips the solution into the mouth or onto the forehead or onto the heart, or it varies from play to play. And suddenly there's this moment when the dead warrior is revived, comes back to life. And it's you know, it's a midwinter ritual. It's clearly about that moment, again, the Christmas moment, I suppose, the solstice moment when life and light returns to the world.
One question.
And Christmas, of course.
Go
Sorry,
ahead.
I was just going to say, Christmas is sitting on the Saturnalian festivals and, you know, all those pagan festivals of the return of light. So, yeah.
Absolutely. One thing I've been mulling lately when it comes to mumming plays is whether the humor that you spoke of is covering the real truth of this moment, or whether it's absolutely essential. It's something that we're supposed to be focusing on, because it's almost as if it's what heals, because
Yeah.
the doctor is introduced in some versions as a quack doctor. There's no question.
Oh, yeah.
That and he
Yeah,
comes
yeah,
in with
yeah.
this, this obviously comic speech, and
Yeah.
and there's something deep and wonderful about this for me, because the quack doctor is he who heals. The sense of play, the sense of magic and possibility, and even foolishness is is healing. It has the power of resurrection in it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I wonder whether it's also something about poetry. I read a wonderful book called Nowhere in America by a guy named Hal Rammel. I've been trying to get him to talk with me. I can't get him to return my messages yet. So Hal, if you happen to see this, holler at me. But I'd love to talk with him. He makes the point of saying that the best performers in the mumming plays were the ones who made the poem rather than the medicine what's really on offer. It's that what the quack doctor is offering is the poem that he's saying, more than the medicine. That's really his.
Yeah. There's that wonderful speech, I can't remember it off the top of my head, but I've been in. He describes the journey that he's made.
Yeah,
to come back with this magical solution. Yeah.
And
it's
all
great.
those great lines about it. If
mad stuff. Yeah.
If there's 19 devils, I can bring 20 out.
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
Yeah. Wonderful.
Yeah. So I wonder whether the mumming play.
I agree with you. I mean, when I was when we were working on stories, we all on a sequence of stories, we always felt, laughter. It has, laughter is the moment where an audience opens up, is when it laughs, when something becomes possible. I think someone described putting together a sequence of stories as ha ha, aha, ah, and amen, or something like that.
That's wonderful. I love that.
Yeah. So it starts with laughter, and then it's we used to call it the ladder to the moon, but yeah, and in Mama's plays, the laughter is just always there, and yeah, it makes something happen, makes something possible.
In a way,
and it's often very subversive as well.
Absolutely. And it, like other rituals that are performed around the time of Carnival, Christmas into Carnival, it makes me wonder whether it's filling a gap, a psychological gap in the Christian experience, because Christian scripture is strong in many areas, but I think one deficiency might be trickster lore. I mean, there's some moments in the Bible and in Christian lore where you can see that trickster energy at work, but I know other traditions that are stronger when it comes to tricksterism.
Yeah.
And the quack doctor comes along and offers some of that salvific comedy and play. I think there's a deep need for play. I read a book recently that talked about the play circuit in mammals, that it's the need for play is as real as the need for food and warmth.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, when the folk tradition works on those biblical stories, the trickster begins to appear, and very often as the devil, in fact. The devil is very often in folk culture a trickster figure, and not to be taken too seriously.
Yeah, and sometimes the precursor to the god, a kind of harbinger of the god.
Well, certainly. I mean, I've got very interested recently in the book of Job, where God and the devil go into cahoots. They're working together. It's a double two-handed operation. It's quite extraordinary. Yeah. So this idea of an absolute good and an absolute evil kind of melts away into something much more interesting.
Absolutely. And the shape shifting that you see in a lot of trickster lore makes me think about all the masking in Mummery and Carnival.
Yeah.
Changing masks is a way of trying on different selves or trying on different perspectives. And often I think that playfulness is exactly the playfulness that enables masking or motivates it is what's missing when people can't get along because they can't try on each other's faces or see through each other's eyes and swap places for a moment.
Yeah.
And the whole Festival of Misrule in a way is a drama that shows that.
Yeah. Yeah. Turning all the hierarchies on their head.
Absolutely. And saying, you know, what would it be like to be this other person for a day? You might see the world differently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah,
I think it's very interesting how the Christian year is underpinned by, I mean, you know, Easter, the way that Christmas is a solar festival and Easter is a lunar festival, I think is extraordinarily interesting as well. So again, the death and resurrection that I suppose reaches its zenith in the Christian year in the crucifixion and resurrection is tied up with the cycles of the moon. Whereas the birth of the solar hero is tied up with the solar cycle.
Yes. One thing that Ronald helped me see is the resonance between Halloween and the May. The way that May Eve and May Day are similar to Halloween energetically, psychically, spiritually.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Beltane and Samhain. And they're the two times in the year when the other world is kind of available, makes itself available.
Yes, and you know,
so in a slightly different form. Yeah.
I wanted to feel that this year, and I found that there's nothing like doing to really find out what's in one of these rituals. I mean, you can read about it and learn a lot, but there's something about going out and doing the thing that is very elucidative. And so this year I actually did the whole May Eve into May morning ritual. I was out all night rambling around the countryside looking for flowers to bring home the next morning. And I really understood that connection between Halloween and the May in a new way. Because for one thing, it is scary to be out there in the woods by yourself. It's dark, and then also you're sleep deprived. And so it gets a little trippy because you're out there, you haven't slept all night and you're sort of hallucinating and you're in the dark. So there were certain aspects of the experience that I had never been able to understand fully just by reading about it. But when I went out there and did it, I really got it.
Yeah.
You know,
and I think you know that twin division of the year between, you know, there's the solstices and the equinoxes, and then there's the Celtic calendar, which has those, you know, it's the 1st of February, the 1st of May, the 1st of August, and the 1st of November, which are the big festivals. And I think with those Celtic festivals, you know, and the May Day and Halloween, Samhain and Beltane, are pivotal in that calendar, are really tuned to the cycles of growth and harvest in a way that the solar festivals aren't. So you know, with May Day, you really get a sense of things coming into life, and with Samhain, you get a sense of the end of harvest and the start of winter, and the kind of the fading of what in Beltane is this kind of surge of vegetative energy that comes with May Day, and then the kind of the fading of it into winter, Beltane, and as you say, actually being out in the landscape, out in the world, in the natural world, in those times, you really feel it.
That life and death coming into contact.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
And it makes sense to me that we speak of Halloween or Halloween night, but May morning, because
yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Because at Bealtaine or the May, you're moving into morning. It's whereas you're moving into the light, whereas at Halloween, Samhain, you're moving into the dark.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. That's a very good point. I'd never really thought of that before, but yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, it's definitely morning, and a morning thing, and it's a dawning thing, and a moving into darkness thing. Yeah. Yeah.
I've noticed that when you tell stories, you have such command of the story. And I want to ask you a question about this. You obviously have them by heart. You can tell them flawlessly. I watched a video of you the other day where you just went for I think an hour straight and never missed a beat. And I'm sure you could go.
Which one was that?
I think it was one. I'm not sure how to tell you which one it was, because there's so many videos of you online, but it was one where you told the story about Jack and the green cap. That was a wonderful story about trying to get home again with the gallows, and
yeah.
And then Tom Tit Tot was in that set of stories as well. A wonderful traveler story about the young girl and the gatless girl spinning.
Oh yeah.
And there's something I wanted to ask you, because I've noticed that when a speaker, could be a storyteller, could be a poet, anybody speaking publicly, has something by heart, there's a danger that it doesn't feel alive, that the listeners can tell, okay, this thing is not improvisatory. It's this person has this down pat. But what I noticed with you is that I never had that feeling. I was captivated from start to finish, and it felt alive, even though I had the sense that you knew it backwards and forwards and every which way. And I wondered, is that just because your delivery is so good and you've practiced it, you know how to put emphasis, you know about, you're controlling cadence, intonation, and so forth? Or is it that you're actually improvising and that you have some variations that you can kind of pull out of your back pocket mid-story? I'm wondering how you get it to feel so alive, even though you obviously have these things down.
Yeah. Well, I think it's partly that things never really quite begin as text. You know, I tend to go for walks and just talk to myself. And if there's a story I hear that I want to tell, I kind of work on it orally.
Oh.
And I tend to remember in terms of image rather than words. So it's like a sequence of pictures that I use as a kind of mnemonic. But at the same time, the more that you tell a story, the more fixed it becomes. So those stories, I mean, all those stories that you mentioned are stories I've told many times. So they've kind of fixed themselves into a form which is pretty solid. It's pretty well the same each time I tell it, but it's not always the same. It's not that if a thought occurred to me in the middle of a story, I might not follow it, you know, or if there was an interruption, I might not try and work it into the story. It's not set in stone. It's still fluid, but as you say, pretty set, pretty fixed. Yeah.
Something important that I learned from that answer you just gave is this idea of crafting it orally. without the pen and paper, because if you're writing, you end up with sentence structure that just doesn't feel like speech.
Yeah.
But if you craft it the way Wordsworth did, just wandering around the Lake District, dreaming up those poems without any paper around, you get something that feels alive, like the human voice.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
that's
the way I tend to work. I mean, sometimes it's more difficult than other times. You know, I've been working most recently on Job. I'm quite interested in Job, but I wanted to stay true to those rhythms of which to some extent are, I guess, oral rhythms anyway, but the rhythms of the language of the King James Bible. So finding a way that both honors that and at the same time feels oral has been a delicate juggling act. But for the most part, yeah, I kind of start with the spoken, and it formalizes itself into something that's semi-fixed.
A friend of mine,
I think because I also write poetry and read poetry. I'm not satisfied with a totally improvised form of storytelling. I want something where the words carry a charge, do the poetic thing. So yeah, I do work on text.
That comes through in your storytelling. I noticed that in one of the stories that had to do with the hazel tree and the well, you clearly loved and wanted to repeat a key phrase, which was "big with gold."
Oh yeah.
And it's something poetically pleasing about that. It's a felicitous phrase, and it's, as you said before, highly imagistic. But that's just an example of many times in your stories when I get the sense of a beautifully crafted phrase that you've put the poet's love and care into the language.
Yeah, and at the same time, you know, I love dialect words and, you know, gapless girls and all that stuff. You know, which are kind of out of oral tradition. Those little turns of phrase. So I try and use those as much as I can. Yeah.
If somebody who's 15 years old or 17 or 18 years old is watching this and thinking, you know, I'd like to be a storyteller, is that a life you can actually have? Can you do that? Is there anything you would say to that person about this idea of actually making a life as a storyteller, making a career of it, both vocation and avocation, perhaps?
Yeah, well, I mean, the only thing to do is to take the plunge and try it. But I lived in a very, very lucky time because, you know, I was growing up in the 60s. There was this whole, in the UK, this isn't necessarily true of the United States, but there was this tremendously generous state provision of education. So, you know, we didn't have to pay for grants for tertiary education. Yeah, I mean, it was a full grant. You know, we didn't have to pay for education at all. And there was an arts council, which meant that a lot of work in the arts was subsidized. And all that is beginning to go now in the UK. There are serious cutbacks in arts funding. So I think here it would be harder for someone to start a career in the arts, probably in any form of the arts, than it was when I was in my early 20s. But yeah, I mean, I think the best thing to do is to experiment and try and find someone whose work you admire, and see if you can apprentice yourself in some way to that person. But I'm sure it's the same in the States. It's increasingly hard to make a living from the arts.
Did you know that you loved performing even as a small child? Was performing something you were always interested in and drawn to?
I'm not really a natural performer. It's a funny thing, you know. I'm not someone who kind of naturally kind of leapt into a spotlight. It's quite a self-conscious teenager, I think. But I found when and it was with the ballads initially, I found that there's a kind of strange possession that takes place, as though a story wants to speak through you, as though it's making a demand. And I found that tremendously exciting. There's a tradition among the travelers and the gypsies that when you tell a story, the person you heard it from is standing behind you as you're speaking, and that person, when they told the story, the person they heard it from, and you get this idea that behind the teller there's a line of ghosts, and when you tell the story, you join that line. And yeah, that sense of being possessed by the voices behind you that kind of demand that their story is told through you. That was what really set me off and started me telling stories and singing songs. Kind of brought with it I don't know, sort of authority, I suppose, a compulsion. Yeah.
Well, thank you for your work. I've
it's a
enjoyed
great
it
pleasure.
very
Thank you
much,
so much for your interest.
and I appreciate that you made time to sit a spell and talk with me today.
Yeah, well, very good to meet you.
You too, Hugh. I don't want to.
And if you're in the UK, do come over and visit.
Absolutely. I hope to come back. I'm actually strongly considering coming for Punky Night this year.
Yeah.
I'd love to be in Hinton, St. George on Punky Night and see the Mangle Wurzels.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Hugh. I hope to talk with you again.
Pleasure.
Someday.
Yeah. Okay. All the best.
What part of the States are you from?
Dallas, Texas.
Oh, Dallas.